So you'll have a chart like this, or the maybe slightly different with different numbers, but this would be the average annual consumer price index. You'll notice that we are using 1982 to 1984 as our index. So we are comparing everything to 1982, 1984. So in your chart, 1982 and 1984, these values should be nearly 100, you'll notice. And then everything's compared to that. So if you're before the 1980s, you would expect it to be less. So the indices here are less than 100. And then if you're after the 1980s, prices are more, then you expect those indices to be more. So the farther away you get from 1980s, you would expect it to be greater the farther above 1980s. Okay, we're going to talk about grandparents that made salaries. So they're telling you a story, and they made salaries of $23,000, or some type of a relative. It doesn't have to be a grandparent, but some relative made $23,000 as their yearly salary in 1978. And we want to compare that for what that would have been, say, for your parents in 2004. So I've highlighted these right here. The index for 1978, and I've also highlighted the index for 2004. So using the formula, which I think it should be in your notebook by now, I've taken the reference price, which is, remember, in 1978. So that was a value that I was given. That's what I plug in for that price in X. Then I multiply by the quotient of the indices. Make sure that the value, the CPI for 1978 is in the denominator, because you're trying to cancel all the information about 1978. Your numerator, in a different color, needs to be about the year you want to change this to. So I want to learn about 2004, so I'm going to use the index for 2004 here. So the only things that go in the formula, the price that you were given times a quotient of indices. How do you know which one goes in the numerator and denominator? Think about what information you need to cancel. If you're trying to get to $2004, put that index in the numerator, and you want to cancel $1978, put that index in the denominator. Okay, you'll notice this quotient here is about 3, and that makes sense because that's telling you that things in 2004 were about 3 times as expensive as in 1978. So that's another way to check that this makes sense. Always reason through if your answer makes sense. When I do this calculation, I get about 66,000, a little over $66,500. So this would be a comparable annual salary for 2004. Okay, 2B talks about inflation rates. So slightly different here. A new vocabulary word, essentially. So inflation rates. We're not going to be given necessarily a price. When you hear inflation rate, we're just trying to find the relative change between the indices among different years. And you'll recall relative change from a previous homework assignment, I hope. So on my work right here, I'm going to underline this. This is simply relative change for the indices. I want to compare the inflation rate from 1978, same 2 years, 1978 to 2004. So I have plugged in the index for 2004. So new minus old, the index for 1978, over the index for 1978. So all this is relative change. I'm sorry, new minus old. If you'll recall the formula I gave you before, always remember to divide by the reference value, the old value. So in minus O, I sometimes write, because no will help you remember the order there. So new minus old over old. Plugging in those indices, I get 1.9, but remember that relative change, that formula is always giving you a percentage. So the inflation rate from 1978 to 2004 was nearly 200%. If you'll recall homework from the beginning of chapter 3, that makes sense with these values because the index here is about 1/3 of that. So that means it increased by about 200%. So that makes sense. So this seems like a reasonable value. And here I just worded that a little bit differently to help you understand what that meant. The cost of items were nearly 3 times as expensive in 2004 as in 1978. So this is to get you thinking, if you'll recall that slide with the M&Ms. So 3 times as expensive means that there was a nearly 200% increase there. Okay, I'm going to go to the next slide. Okay, another cute problem. So for 2C, using the exact same chart, I want to compare coffee prices. So in 1978, a cup of coffee. So our grandparents, your grandparents, perhaps might go to the cafe and they could buy a cup of coffee just for $0.25. So $0.25 for a cup of coffee in 1978. But in 2004, so this would be back when I was in college, a coffee might be more expensive. So $2.50 might have been a cup of coffee in 2004. I want to look at the inflation rate for a cup of coffee. Inflation rate, I'm going to use the formula relative change. So I take the difference in the prices. So new minus old, $2.50 minus $0.25 would be $2.25. Divided by the old value, the reference value from 1978, and that gives me exactly 9. So there are 9 quarters that go into $2.25. 9 there means 900. And I wrote another sentence here to make sure that to help you understand what this meant. It might be covered up by my menu, but 900% increase here means that the cost of coffee in 2004 was 10 times the price as it was in 1978. And since I'm using easy prices here, that should make sense. $2.50 is exactly 10 times 25 cents. So these values should all make sense now if you understand what that percent change means. So inflation rate is always giving you a percentage. You use relative change to find it. When you interpret it, be sure that you understand what that interpretation is. A 900% increase in inflation means that the value was 10 times the price it was before. One thing that I wanted to say, because your homework is going to ask some questions about this, the cup of coffee increased by 900%. That might be a result of new companies such as Starbucks making coffee a fancier object. This increase of 900% is huge. Inflation doesn't necessarily increase at that type of a rate. The inflation rate between 1978 and 2004, we did on the previous slide for 2B, was 190%. So inflation rate from 1978 to 2004 was about 200%. The cup of coffee, the reason that increased so much might not be due to inflation, it might be due to other circumstances. So a couple problems in your homework are trying to get you to think about that, and they'll ask you some questions. I'm effectively just trying to get you to think about that. So my statement here is to help you with that idea. When I gave you these 2 problems, 2B and 2C, the cup of coffee increased at a greater rate, 900%, than the overall rate of inflation. So the increase in the cost of coffee may have not just been due to inflation. So if you're a researcher, you might need to dig into that a little bit deeper to figure out why it was 900% compared to the 200% for overall inflation. So that's a statement I wanted to make to get you thinking about a couple of those homework problems that you'll have to answer. And I'm going to do one more problem to help you think about healthcare. So this shows up at the end of your homework. And I think the hardest thing about this is that you're working with large numbers and you're having to put together the ideas in this assignment. So I think that this is the very last problem in your homework. And I wrote you try, so I think I want to give you all a minute to try this on your own and maybe just jot it down in pencil in your notebook, and then I'll go through it. The total spending on healthcare for in a certain region rose from 964 million in 1970 to 898 billion in 2007. I need you to recognize that one of those values is in millions, one is in billions. If you don't catch that, you're going to miss the problem. But so once we have those numbers, the assignment here is to find the relative change in healthcare. That's the new minus old over old. So I'm going to give you a minute to try that on your own. And then the second part of this, to get you started, you're going to use the CPI to compare the overall rate of inflation between the 2 years. So I'm going to go through these. If you can, at least do part 1, and then try to do part 2 if you can. If you have my slides open, you could go back and forth without me having to, but here's what your work should look like for the first part. The answer to this is what we just threw in the chat. I had that anonymous, but you did a terrific job. 93,053.53%. So 53 hundredths there. 93,053 and 53 hundredths percent. That's the relative change in healthcare. The rate of inflation was different. The main idea here is I want you to compare whether the relative change was larger or smaller than the overall rate of inflation. So the rate of inflation is just a general rate of inflation for our US dollars, cost of living. It's putting together inflation completely. So this value is just for our overall country's inflation, whereas this value is for healthcare. And I want you to think about right now, I'd like to hear from y'all. Did healthcare increase at the same rate as our inflation, or a larger rate, or smaller? And I got a good direct message. The rate of inflation was around 242%, whereas the rate of healthcare, the change in healthcare, was 93,053%. So what you should get from this problem when you're doing your homework, you'll have to answer some questions about it. The overall relative change in healthcare was far greater than the overall rate of inflation. And so I'll leave that part, as well as I'll leave the setup. So you have to, I want you to put in some effort and actually get these answers. But that's to give you help for that, to kind of support you in that last problem. And then the intent is that you'll think about that change. So healthcare in our country, we know, has become very expensive, and this problem is just highlighting that.